Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. We are the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC, one of three IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. HDIAC serves as one of the premier information research partners and curators of technology advancements and trends for the Homeland Defense and Security community. As such, our organization supports those working in the Homeland Defense and Security domain of DoD research and engineering. We do so by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. With an understanding of the Homeland Defense and Security DoD research and engineering landscape, we provide research and analysis services. We help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We hope you enjoy this webinar presentation and that it serves as a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD Homeland Defense and Security research.
Okay, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. My name is John Clements, and I'm the technical lead for HDIAC. And before we begin, I just want to note a couple of administrative items and some housekeeping. So first, if you are dialed in by phone and would like a copy of the slides, they were posted to the HDIAC webinar announcement, and you can go to hdiac.dtic.mil/webinars and find today's webinar. For those of you that are online, I've posted the links, both a shortened link and the full link, in the chat. So you should be able to go grab them there if you want them. When you get to the web page at the bottom of the announcement, it'll say download presentation. You'll see a button there and you can click that to get the presentation. Secondly, all participants are muted, but you can chat with the presenters and hosts. However, if you would like to submit a question for the Q&A, I would just ask that you try to use the Q&A function. It should be at the bottom right of your screen. You'll see in a 3-dot ellipses menu. And if you click on that, you'll see the Q&A function listed there. And if you submit in there, it's just much easier to keep track of the questions there. But I'll also be monitoring the chat. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, don't worry, the full presentation will be available online later. You can check back on the HDI website. Once the webinar is posted, the Go to Webinar button will take you to the YouTube link. You can also just check our YouTube page and keep up with it there. You can go to youtube.com/@HDIAC, the @ symbol HDIAC. If all goes well, the recording will be up by the end of today if we don't have any technical issues with getting it up there. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's webinar presenter. So for today's webinar is the security implications for the United States from Iranian and Hezbollah activities in Latin America and the Caribbean, presented by Dr. Evan Ellis. And Dr. Ellis is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, with a focus on the region's relationships with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors, as well as transnational organized crime and populism in the region. Dr. Ellis, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank HDIX and all of you here online listening for your interest in this topic and the opportunity to share my work on this with you. I am a civilian employee of the U.S. Army at the Army War College, so I'd like to emphasize that everything I'm about to say, of course, is my academic views and not necessarily that of my institution or the U.S. Army or U.S. government. With that, what I'd like to talk to you about today is understanding in the broader global context what Iran especially and Hezbollah, it's one of its key surrogates, is doing in Latin America. For that, that, I have a presentation which I'm going to share with you right now. Of course, this is the presentation that we mentioned will be available following online for your download as well. So to begin with, what I would like to do is frame a little bit, first of all, Hezbollah, and then later getting to Iran. Of course, Hezbollah is one of several surrogates you've probably familiar with through its activities in Lebanon and in the Middle East and the conflict with Israel. But when we look at specifically Hezbollah in Latin America, it's important to emphasize that its function is a little bit different than the political and more terrorist-oriented functions that it takes on in the Middle East. But to understand Hezbollah's activities and networks in Latin America and in the Caribbean, first, it's important to understand that it is rooted in part, although not entirely, in the Lebanese diaspora. That is a diaspora that has been in the region for well over a century, but really expanded greatly following the 1979 Lebanese civil war. And so what you find is that depending on how you count Lebanese descent, something between 7 and 14 million persons within the region may be considered to be of partial Lebanese descent. Some of the key areas, certainly Brazil, where you have as many as 5 million people of Lebanese descent, and particularly in major population centers such as Sao Paulo. In Argentina, where you may have as many as 1 to 3 million people of Lebanese descent. And of course, Chile, Colombia, especially the area in the northeast of the country, Maicao, Ecuador, especially the coastal region, Guayaquil, as well as Paraguay, the triple frontier area that you probably heard about, including Ciudad del Este, as well as Panama. Also recognizing that when we talk about Lebanese in Latin America, this is a community economically and politically is very well established. And so indeed, when you look at some of the distinguished thing, a number of different presidents, Luis Mario Abdo Benitez, the previous president of Paraguay, Michel Temer of Brazil, Abdullah Bucaram of Ecuador, just to name a few. And of course, Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest business people in Mexico. And you may have heard of Shakira, a singer of Lebanese, Colombian descent, to name a few. And so when we're talking about Hezbollah, also understanding that the broader Lebanese community has been relatively well integrated in import-export activities in the region. And that creates the opportunity for the generation of a lot of financial flows and trade flows. But again, important to understand that, first of all, of the Lebanese community, really only a small portion are practicing Muslims at all. A number of them are Druze or other religious groupings. And of those who are Muslim, of course, only a small fraction of those can be affiliated with any direct terrorist connections or network connections such as Hezbollah. So we're really talking about a piece of the community. Now, having said that, when we talk specifically about what Hezbollah as an organization does in the region, first of all, as I indicated before, by contrast to what you see in Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East, Hezbollah in Latin America has principally been an organization that raises money. Also useful to emphasize that a portion of this money, actually a significant portion, is what we'd call legitimate. Just as people in other countries send money back home to those in need, you have those who are generating a lot of money through lucrative businesses in Latin America, within the Lebanese Syrian community, sending money back home in the Middle East in the form of remittances, or with respect to what is considered charitable giving within the Islamic framework, zakat. But of course, there is a illicit component to that as well. And so Hezbollah as an organization, you find various different people who are affiliated with Hezbollah over the years who have been involved with drugs and money laundering. Some of the key cases, one of the earliest high-profile cases was Chekri Harb, going back in 2008, who was involved with various different Colombian narco-trafficking groups, laundering money and helping to move drugs for that group. Another high-profile case was Operation Mendaz in Brazil, where it was estimated that a Hezbollah-affiliated affiliated group operating in Brazil, may have moved over the course of 5 years, ending in about 2015, as much as $10 million. You find other types of activities, the use of crypto money, especially in the Triple Frontier area, Ciudad del Este, that I mentioned before, and also in that area, but not exclusively confined to that area, you find some of the key people who have been affiliated with Hezbollah money-generating networks. I would mention, of course, the Barakat family, Assad Ahmed Barakat, who, again, for about 20 years, in and out of legal difficulties, has been operating in the region, as well as Sobi Mahmoud Fayed. Also, I would mention Joseph Nasrallah, who was in Sao Paulo. He was actually grabbed in Coritiba in Brazil a number of years ago, known as the Sheik, again, using a combination of involvement in moving drugs and money between Brazil and Europe, including through Africa. So again, you see a lot of structures for moving money, often involving both illicit and the illicit. But it is useful to recognize that periodically there have been people affiliated with Hezbollah who in Latin America have also engaged in terrorism against targets in the region or against the United States. The high-profile cases that are worth mentioning, number one, the attacks in Argentina, first of all, against the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992, and a even bloodier attack that came 2 years later against the Israeli community center, also in Buenos Aires, the AIMIA Center, which resulted in some 85 deaths and over 300 injured. The Argentines like to remind one that some of those very bloody attacks were some of the first major incidents of Islamic terrorism in the region, of course, before 9/11 in our particular case. But it didn't just stop there. Again, at a lower level, some foiled and some not. You have, for example, the case of Mohammed Hamdar, who was grabbed by Peruvian authorities in the greater Lima area near Surco, Peru in 2014, with various different explosive devices in his apartment, believed to be preparing attacks against Jewish targets in Peru. You had incidences in where the Brazilian drug gang, the First Capital Command, or PCC, was involved in collaborating with Hezbollah to help purchase arms, possibly for movement between regions. Then another major case that came up, which was ferreted out through something called Operation Hashtag, was during the Rio de Janeiro Olympics in 2016, where, again, collaboration between U.S. and Israeli authorities and Brazilian authorities was able to unleash a number of radicalized individuals affiliated with Hezbollah planning attacks against the Rio Olympics. A couple other major cases, again, just illustrating how there are some attempts by Hezbollah to exercise terrorism in the region. One case occurred in Panama a year later in 2017. Samir El-Debek, who I believe was from actually Dearborn, Michigan, but had become radicalized and was captured, or at least it was identified in Panama, scouting out different targets against the U.S. Embassy, the Israeli Embassy, and Panama Canal related targets. It was believed to try to act against those targets. A later case, a similar case in Colombia in 2021, was targeting of U.S. citizens and Israelis as well in Colombia. And the two most recent cases illustrating that this is an ongoing challenge, especially as things tend to continue to unfold in the other side of the world in the Middle East. That in November 2023, something called Operation Trapiche in Brazil, where Brazilian authorities, with the help of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, were able to identify a plan to attack a number of Brazilian citizens in Brazil, again, Hezbollah affiliated. And then, of course, the most recent, going back to the one of the key Hezbollah money men, Assad Barakat, that I mentioned before. Barakat was actually identified as having traveled to an area subject to a lot of import-export traffic in the region in the north of Chile, the port of Iquique. His identity there was actually flagged by the head of the Argentine National Security Ministry, Patricia Bullrich, who actually called attention to her Chilean counterpart and also publicly highlighted this as a expression of warning that there was possible Hezbollah activity in the north of Chile, in that high volume port where a lot of contraband and other things traditionally have moved. So again, the key point here, just in these examples, is to illustrate that on the one hand, by contrast to the Middle East, Hezbollah in Latin America has traditionally been a money generating and laundering activity, but there have been periodically some different instances of terrorism, raising the prospect that depending on what happens with Hezbollah in its battle with Israel in Lebanon and the Middle East, that Hezbollah could easily turn to Latin American targets, especially governments such as those of Argentina or possibly Paraguay, with the Santiago Peña government there, who are seen as pro-Israel or pro-United States. Although the focus is on Hezbollah, it is useful to acknowledge that there are various other Islamic extremist organizations that during different times have played roles in terrorism in Latin America. To understand that, and again, I focused in that last slide a lot on the Lebanese diaspora, and this is not to say that everyone who is in Hezbollah is automatically coming from the Lebanese diaspora. There is some radicalized nationals of other countries associated with that as well, but also when you take a look at the overall patterns of migration, where the population who adheres to Islam comes from, it's useful to point out that within the Caribbean basin, which was subject to multiple waves of migration, people who could travel from Asia, East Asia, places like Java, Indonesia, during the time of British colonial presence in the Caribbean, as well as similar flows coming from parts of the Dutch Caribbean and others. And so today, when you look at countries that were either part of the British Commonwealth or affiliated with the Dutch, such as Guyana associated with the British, Suriname associated with the Dutch, and Trinidad and Tobago associated with the British, what you see is that there was a certain group of people adhering to Islam that traveled there. Now, the Caribbean culture into which they came today, although you do have Islamic practices, especially in those countries, what you find is that most of the mosques and most of that practice in the Caribbean tradition tends to be relatively tolerant in terms of clothing and dress and various religious strictures. But what you also find is that within the Caribbean culture, various different marginalized groups, especially some of the more economically marginalized Afro-Caribbean populations, there have been various communities that have been radicalized around particular mosques in the region that have been the source of some of the problems that you may have heard about. Two events worth mentioning. Number one, back in 2000, a number of people, again, who had become radicalized in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, were involved in a plot to try to plant bombs in the John F. Kennedy Airport, although that was foiled. Probably the better known case was in Trinidad and Tobago, where again you have a community, but again, there's a group that you may have heard of, the JAM, or the Jamaat al-Muslimin. The group actually came not so much from the from those people in Trinidad and Tobago of Javanese or East Indian descent, but rather the transfer to a group of Afro-Caribbean personnel who at the time were concentrated in the police force. The JAM, the Jamaat al-Muslimin, actually initially got adherents because it was built around not only a radical imam, but also a police captain who initially, in the name of Islam and imposing purity against what he saw as a very corrupt Trinidad and Tobago state, tried an attempt to take over the Trinidadian parliament, what he called a citizen's arrest. And so this little-known incident in the Caribbean was probably one of the earliest incidences in the Western Hemisphere of an Islamic to take over a Caribbean government. So next time you have Trivial Pursuit, you've got something there. But what happened with the group, with the Jamaat al-Muslimin, is that the teachings in a few radical mosques, especially with some marginalized street kids, there were three particular mosques that had particular problems with imams who were teaching more radical versions of Islam. One in a place called Rio Claro with an imam by the name of Nazim Muhammad. And as you recall, this was the time when you had the Islamic State fighting in Lebanon and Syria. And so what happened is these kids were basically marginalized street kids, but who had been pointed in a negative direction by this radicalized imam that going over to fight for Islam in the name of Muhammad in Lebanon and Syria was a good way to show they were tough and earn what a colleague of mine, retired Colonel Claudio Carrizales, used to call to get street creds. Sadly, virtually all of the people who went over to fight for ISIS from Trinidad and Tobago were either killed, used as cannon fodder by the much more sophisticated locals involved in ISIS, or once over there for different legal reasons were not able to come back. Some were actually trapped in detention facilities after having illegally entered the country. Actually, some took their children over there, and their children were trapped over there. But the bottom line is, if you've heard something about the Caribbean contributing to radical Islam and fighters for ISIS, that sad little bubble was what it was all about. In addition, there have been some other instances of ISIS throughout the region. I would just mention two examples to give you a flavor for it. In one case, you had a Cuban by the name of Raul Gutierrez, who back in 2018 was picked up in Colombia. Apparently, he had been scoping out, trying to get a job at a diner that was frequented by U.S. Embassy personnel there in Colombia, I believe in Bogota, and with the intention of trying to do a suicide bomb or otherwise do harm to the Americans frequenting that place. In the case of Brazil, you had another a member basically of the Al-Khatib group, and he and a number of other special interest aliens were identified by the U.S. State Department as pertaining to basically a cell of ISIS that was operating in the region. So again, we talk mostly about Hezbollah, but even now, as we think about the morphing of different groups, important to understand that from a variety of different, generally tolerant Islamic traditions, but sometimes with radical mosques and other things, we do find other types of cells of radical Islam in Latin America. Turning now to Iran, what I'd like to highlight by this, first of all, is again recognizing that although Hezbollah principally functions as a surrogate group of Iran and benefits from their financing and their guidance, Hezbollah is not 100% under the operational control of Iran. So there is some difference between Iran and Hezbollah. Now, when we talk about Iran in general, first of all, important to note that as a state, Iran historically has had limited commercial activities and political presence in Latin America. Its core points of presence have been through relatively anti-U.S. Populist states, especially Venezuela beginning under Hugo Chavez, Bolivia beginning under Evo Morales, and a number of others. Having said that, when we think of other actors of concern, extra hemispheric actors such as China or, for example, Russia, just to give you a point of comparison, last year Latin America exported a little over $200 billion of goods, largely commodities, to China. Compare that $200 billion to about $163 million, so about one part in 1,000th. What Latin America exported to China is what it exported to Iran. So it's not about commercial opportunity, although you do find a little bit of a significant commercial relationship with Brazil, where the things that Iran imports. Iran imports about $1.6 billion of goods from the region. And again, you can see from the figure here that almost all of that is agricultural and other products that it imports from Brazil. But again, it's mostly about Iranian activities trying to project presence through political and special programs more than it is any type of natural enduring commercial presence, such as when we think about China. So as I indicated before, there are different phases in Iran's relationship with Latin America. You may remember from about 2005, you had a very vocal Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who traveled with a lot of frequency to Latin America, especially to places like Venezuela, with a lot of cooperative programs. Now, after the end of the Ahmadinejad regime, you may remember Ahmadinejad also went to Bolivia, where he played a game of friendly soccer with Evo Morales. The concept with Ahmadinejad was really to show the power of his presidency in the context of the conservative mullahs that he was helping Iran to escape from its isolationism by his diplomacy, which was really only partially successful. But at the time, Venezuela, then as now, continued to be really the primary Iranian point of entry into the region. However, after Ahmadinejad, you had President Rouhani, who, while he was trying to negotiate an agreement to get Iran out from international sanctions through what was called the JCPOA, tried to stay away from Latin America and being too provocative. Rouhani, at the very end of his term, did actually go to a non-aligned summit, traveling to Venezuela in Cuba, I believe, in 2016. But again, it was very different than the high-profile kind of in-your-face activities that you saw from Ahmadinejad. Now, after that, of course, you had Ebrahim Raisi, who, again, with the collapse of the JCPOA agreement during the first Trump administration and the renewed hostility towards Iran and the United States, Raisi began to re-engage with Latin America. In part, that was working through Hezbollah. But in part, it was also working through the traditional threat hosts of Iran and Latin America. So the chief one, again, has always been Venezuela. And so what you saw was beginning in 2020, you had Iran trying to help Venezuela, first of all, to repair some of its older refineries, beginning with the Cardon refinery. The Iranian airline Mahan Air was shipping over refinery parts and sending over technical personnel in exchange for Venezuelan gold, which was broadly believed to be laundered through Turkey. And then following that, you had a broader series of agreements between Iran and Venezuela to repair several other refineries, again, in exchange for Venezuelan gold, as well as to swap Venezuelan heavy crude for Iranian light crude, which then could be mixed with some of the heavier Venezuelan really kind of tar sludge grade crudes, so that Venezuela could then have something that it could refine and sell on the oil market. In addition to some of the re-engagement with Venezuela, which also included other things, military things that I'll talk about in a minute, you also had outreach to other anti-U.S. states. And so this was at the time in which, of course, the Ortega regime in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, his wife, had a election that was largely seen as fraudulent. Nicaragua was increasingly isolated, and so this was an opportunity for Iran to reach out also to Nicaragua. There had been some outreach previously back in the Ahmadinejad days, but this was a significant re-engagement, as well as to Cuba, which was becoming increasingly desperate for money. And so again, about the 2023 timeframe, you had a Iranian business outreach to Cuba, talking about some of the ways in which they could economically cooperate. That one, probably one of the high points of that was a trip by President Raisi himself with his defense minister to negotiate a series of deals. And then there was actually a separate deal that was signed with Bolivia, in which Iran would give Bolivia some of its drone technology, help Bolivia to airspace through in Argentina, something which, as you can imagine, Iranian drones, in that airspace caused a number of difficulties and questions to be asked of the Arce regime in Bolivia by their neighbors in Peru and in Argentina. But so you had that initial state-to-state engagement, and of course there's been also an opportunity for Iran to engage more broadly in Latin America through the BRICS and the expanded BRICS Forum. For those of you who haven't heard of this, this is the organization that originally came out of came out of a concept of a financial analyst, Tim O'Neill, I believe it was, back well more than a decade ago. It was originally Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Later, South Africa was added through a series of expansion as the BRICS became a more or less intercontinental political organization. The membership was increased to 10, and recently in the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, an additional 13 members were added, taking it up to 23 full or partial members. But Iran, during that second enlargement, was brought into the BRICS. So there, Iran has an opportunity to interface in Latin America with Brazil, and most recently, also in the meeting that I mentioned in Kazan, Russia, also Cuba and Bolivia were brought into the expanded BRICS. And so within the BRICS framework, again, there's some opportunity for Iran to pursue what I would call an illiberal state diplomacy with certain states in Latin America. One of the things that I wanted to mention when we talk specifically about Iran is that you do find that to a certain degree, especially beginning with Venezuela, there has been what I would call a normalization of the military dimension of those activities. And so over the years, for example, Iran has given a number of fast attack boats. These are the same basic boats that they use in the Persian Gulf, the Zulfiqar class small fast boats. They go about 50 miles an hour or so. They put missile launchers and things on them. Iran has actually sold to Venezuelans various different classes of missiles, including something adapted from I believe it's the C-802 Chinese missile that the Iranians use a lot on their own version of the boats. Iran has also provided Venezuela with various different classes of drones over the years, including the relatively large, what the Iranians call the Mojaher 6 drone, as well as the smaller flying wing. I believe it's the Mojaher 2, among others. Indeed, going back to the Ahmadinejad days, you actually have Iran believed to collaborate in the Paraguaná Peninsula with the Venezuelan military industry entity called Kavim, in, at the very least, collaboration on developing and maybe manufacturing drones. And some people believe that Iran may have been collaborating with Venezuela there on the Paraguaná Peninsula to also to refine its missile technology in places that was maybe a little bit farther away from the watchful eye of U.S. and other intelligence organizations. Beyond Venezuela, I would also emphasize that traditionally Iran had not really sent any military forces other than small amounts of equipment or its elite, essentially religious special forces activists, Quds forces, but one significant milestone occurred with the new, more radicalized version of the leftist government of Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva of Brazil. And that was, again, in March of, I believe it was 2023, you had the ship, the Macron. The Macron is basically Iran's flagship. It's basically an oil tanker with a bunch of steel plate basically put over the top, so you can launch helicopters and things off the deck and put things inside. But the Macron came over and sailed around South America in somewhat of an evasive pattern before finally putting into port in Rio de Janeiro with its escort ship, the Dana, which actually stayed off of the coast. But again, this was the first time with Macron putting into port in Rio de Janeiro that a government in the region had openly allowed a Iranian warship to put into port. And this was, as you may imagine, certainly with in defiance of U.S. attempts to convince the Brazilian government of Lula da Silva not to do that. Now, I mentioned the Iranian religious forces. I mean, these are not special forces in the sense that we think of special operations forces, military forces, but essentially the kind of elite squads that are used for doing various activities of spreading radicalism with some military capabilities that the Quds forces. Again, over the years, the entry of those personnel into the region, Venezuela has traditionally, going back to Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro, been the primary point of entry. Back in the early days, there was a Venezuelan airliner called Conviasa, which would essentially leave Iran. I believe it would make a stop in Turkey, and then it would come to Caracas, Venezuela. And that was believed to be one of the primary sources of unmonitored flows bringing Iranian operatives into the region through Venezuela. In addition to that, in more recent years, I'd mentioned the Mahan airline flights that were used to bring over supplies, the Iranian airline to bring over supplies to repair those Venezuelan refineries, such as the Cardon refinery. The Mahan Airlines was later sanctioned by the United States, couldn't operate internationally, and so it was interesting. The assets of Mahan Airline were actually taken over by the Maduro government in Venezuela, who reflagged an airline called Emtrasur. From the very beginning, this was very shady. They had basically one great big, I believe it was a 747 airliner that would fly around with very, very little cargo and a suspiciously big crew, up to 14 people. And some of the patterns of the Emtrasur flights, again, it was Venezuelan flagged, but it was seen as largely being used to move Iranians and Hezbollah operatives around the region. So some of those flights included a flight that went down to the Triple Frontier area, the Ciudad del Este, that you probably heard a lot about. And interestingly, it actually made a stop bringing cigarettes, contraband cigarettes, it was believed, to Aruba. The interesting thing about that was that the company who owned those cigarettes was actually that of Horacio Cartes, the previous president of Paraguay. And so there have been some indications that you'll see on the unclassed side talking about the ties that it's believed that Horacio Cartes has, not only with narco trafficking but with Hezbollah and others. And so, that Aruba stop is probably one of those illustrations of some of those concerns. But the same Emtrasur Airlines flight, as you may recall, also made a stop in Argentina, where it was subject to an order to grab the airline for basically sanctions busting. And so, remember going back to the 1992 and 1994 Iran-backed Hezbollah attacks against Jewish targets in Argentina. So governments on both the left and right have been very sensitive about Hezbollah and Iranian-backed terrorism in Argentina. And so we were lucky that we were able to get the cooperation of Argentine authorities, despite at the time the leftist Peronist government of Alberto Fernandez being in power. And when they grabbed that airliner, first to try to get off the ground and go to Uruguay, but it was turned around. But when they grabbed the airliner, they found that the suspiciously large crew in this empty airliner that was flying around was actually comprised of a number of people who were tied to both Iranian Quds forces and Hezbollah. One of the people who was prominently mentioned was Gholam Reza Ghassemani, who again was a relatively high-ranking person within the Quds forces, being moved around by this Venezuelan airline. So you begin to see a little bit of kind of the modus operandi of all of this. Now, a couple other areas that are worth mentioning. One of the big concerns has been that Venezuela has been, both through criminal and maybe explicit government cooperation, one of the primary places in which Iranians and other operatives of Hezbollah have been able to get visas, Venezuelan passports, to be able to travel throughout the region. This is probably one of the reasons why Venezuelan passports are generally not accepted in a lot of different parts of Latin America, because these things are relatively known. But having said that, one of the other kind of axes of spreading influence around, and I mentioned before the issue of radicalized mosques, or also what are called community centers, or centers for studying Islam, or for Islamic communities. The Islamic centers in the region, there are probably between 80 and 100, depending on how you count them. But one of the issues is that those centers have also been kind of a recruiting point for identifying youth in the region who are interested in deepening their study of Islam. And there are scholarships available to go back to these religious teaching schools in places like the holy city of Qum. These are referred to as the madrasas. And there are various different religious school programs. There's not just one government program. But what's interesting is that one of the biggest programs of religious schools of madrasas, which is seen as a recruiting ground for Islamic radicals within Iran, is currently run by a man by the name of Moshin Rabbani. Now, again, going back to the 1992-1994 Argentine attacks, Moshin Rabbani at that time was the Iranian cultural attaché to Argentina. He was the person that was believed to have been running the Hezbollah agents in Argentina, and later was believed to be tied to other different Islamic networks in Brazil, and possibly the people who were recruited in the JFK airport attack in 2007 that I mentioned before. But again, kind of putting this idea of the Islamic Center serving as recruiting for madrasas in Iran and in that network. And I would mention that there have been periodic other activities by Iran in the region which are not directly tied to Hezbollah. I would mention two older ones just to illustrate some of the variety of things that you see. There was a case, for example, in Mexico back in the early 2000s in which a group of computer science professors and students in Mexico's big public university in Mexico City, UNAM, approached the Iranian embassy and were they're basically offering to do cyber espionage and cyber attacks against U.S. targets. Of course, it appeared the Iranian ambassador actually played along with this. Unfortunately, they did a pretty bad job at keeping this secret because a film crew from Univision, a Spanish-speaking TV station or TV regional TV network actually penetrated and actually got these offers to do espionage on microphone, and this was actually exposed not by intelligence agencies but basically by Univision. In addition to that, there was another case where Iranian agents thought that they were working with a very bloody elite Mexican militarized criminal organization, the Zetas, and they thought they were hiring members of the Zetas in the United States to try to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States in a suburb of Washington, D.C. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for them, the person that they thought was a member of the Zetas, it was actually a sting operation. I believe they're actually working for the DEA, and they ended up exposing this Iranian network. But it's just a way of showing that there is hard evidence of ongoing Iranian malevolence within the region, in addition to just running Hezbollah networks. And again, both respect to Hezbollah and in here in Iran as well. The question is, although right now things seem to have settled down quite a bit with Iran's restricted response to Israel, and really Israel's decimating of the Hezbollah leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah, its leader in Lebanon. But always that risk that if there is an escalation between Iran and Israel, or between Iran and the United States, that these networks that Iran has in Latin America, principally through anti-U.S. States such as Venezuela, Nicaragua, and to a certain extent others, could be activated in different ways. So what I'd like to end on here before turning over to questions is this question of, well, what are actually the risks to the U.S. homeland in peacetime and wartime that come out of these activities? And just I would highlight a couple here. Number one, of course, as we've indicated, that activities by Hezbollah in the region are a way of financing Iranian terrorism and Hezbollah terrorism elsewhere, especially in Lebanon and in the Middle East. Number two, as we illustrated, Iran oftentimes collaborates with regimes such as Venezuela in developing military technologies, such as the drones that we actually see being given by Iran to Russia for use against Ukraine, as well as possibly missile technologies that could become broader types of risks. Number three, we see that Iran has had a role, especially with Venezuela, through its support to Venezuela's oil industry, through its arms industries, in empowering and weaponizing these regimes in ways that could allow these regimes to act against the United States in the future. One area that I would illustrate is that there have been some unclassified documentation that Iran has given Venezuelan Navy personnel underwater demolitions training in its facility in Bandar Abbas. And so the ability of Venezuelans to know basically how to blow up things like oil platforms underwater could directly come into play if Venezuela ever tries to do something either covertly or otherwise against oil platforms of entities like Exxon operating off of the coast of Guyana, off of the coast of its disputed Essequibo region. Of course, the Iranian and Hezbollah operations in the region also create space both for planning and financing, but potentially launching terrorist attacks against the U.S. homeland. Certainly a part of that is the possibility of military-age males to enter across the U.S. border, and possibly those who've already been in the U.S. border. And again, the issue of entering with Venezuelan passports and some of the personnel, such as the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, creates these possibilities that massive Venezuelan immigration into the United States, that there could be some flow of other special interest aliens tied with Hezbollah through that. And there is a steady stream of people with possible links to organizations like Hezbollah that are identified on a routine basis by the Border Patrol. In addition to that, of course, as I mentioned before, Iran not only could potentially, or Hezbollah could potentially attack the United States, but it's through its presence in the region, friends of Israel or friends of the United States, such as the very pro-Israel Javier Milei regime in Argentina, or the Santiago Peña regime in Paraguay, could become potential targets. And then also, although we really haven't talked about the prospect of a war in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and China, keep in mind that Iran works very closely with China with respect to oil projects in Iran itself, and alliances in other parts of the world, and of course now also in other areas such as the BRICS forum that we talked about before. And so when we think about Iran's or Hezbollah's action in the region, one other possibility is that in the event that there is ever a U.S.-China war in the Indo-Pacific, and the PRC is looking to get the collaboration of its friends from around the world to create distractions or difficulties for the U.S. within its own within its own hemisphere, and or even to put the U.S. homeland at risk, it is possible that a war between the U.S. and China, Iran could come into play as well. Just in the same way that Iran is providing drone technology to Russia today, and just in the same way that Korea is providing personnel and missiles and artillery systems to Russia today in its war. So that is my presentation. With that, I am going to stop the sharing. And with the remaining time that we have left, which I believe is about 10 minutes, I'm happy to take your questions. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your feedback and any questions you may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. We do have a couple questions that came in throughout the presentation. So the first one, given the most recent events in Syria, do you anticipate Iran and Hezbollah will turn some attention away from Latin America to address the ongoing crisis in Syria?
It's a great question. So first of all, that is, various different levels of complexity. My first indication is that the loss of the Hezbollah, ally of the Assad regime in Syria, probably weakens Hezbollah in generally globally, and weakens really Iran to a certain extent globally. Now, to a certain degree, one can argue that its position in Syria for the moment has already been lost. So, one of two things are possible, and I think probably both at the same time. Number one, and also even before we get to Syria, I think it's important to talk about the debilitation of Hezbollah in Lebanon itself, in South Lebanon. You go back to the Israeli campaign, and especially the series of strikes that began with the strikes against the pagers and walkie-talkies of Hezbollah operatives, but then extended into the campaign in Lebanon, which really decimated the Hezbollah leadership. And so I think from that time, we've seen a dramatic weakening of the political leadership and military infrastructure of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which probably also puts Hezbollah globally into a little bit of disarray in terms of what to do and who to help and how. So I think both the Israeli successes against Hezbollah in Lebanon and the ouster of their very key ally, Assad in Syria, probably puts Hezbollah activities in certain places on hold. But having said that, it does create the risk of the exact opposite as well, which is that from a point of weakness, that if there is a escalation of the of a global campaign, that could lead to interest in Hezbollah doing asymmetric attacks in places where it traditionally has tried to lie low, such as Latin America. So again, I guess what I'm trying to say is all things are possible. The weakening is probably a good thing, but weakening can also lead to unexpectedly riskier or violent behavior. So I think we need to be alert to both possibilities.
Outstanding. And you bring up the pager attacks, and that seems like it was ages ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. It's just that much has happened over in recent history. Next question. Excuse me here. Sorry about that. I just accidentally closed it out. There we go. What are the ballpark number of active Hezbollah members and those supporting monetarily or financially? If you have a guess on that, I guess.
That's it. It's a great question. I mean, the numbers vary greatly. I wouldn't want to even hazard a guess because I just don't have those numbers. But I would say that when you say members, you have to be careful. Are you talking support network? Are you talking financial and members? Even within Lebanon itself, you had a military organization, and you had basically a political organization which included people who were adherents and loyal to Hezbollah as a party. And so and just to give you an example, there was a figure that was tossed out in the U.S. Southern Command magazine Dialogo that talked about between as many as 1 million people who had regular contacts with Hezbollah, perhaps in the Sao Paulo area. To me, that number was dramatically, grossly high. I think you're probably talking numbers in the maybe thousands in Latin America. But again, you have to say you have to have a distinction between levels, which is people who are Hezbollah sympathizers, people who are sending money back to for remittances and zakat that finds its way into the networks of radical organizations. It used to be the Al-Qaeda network was the big one, versus people who are actively affiliated, with Hezbollah, politically through their, criminal money laundering activity, versus again people who have military ties. And in my sense is that people who are working with Hezbollah to actively conduct and plan military operations in Latin America is again, for the moment, fortunately, infinitesimally small. But again, those numbers can shrink and swell. So please forgive my imprecision, but I think it's important to understand kind of what level of belonging are we talking about, in recognizing that the composition of the organization in terms of political, military, and money raising in Latin America is very, very different than what it is, in my judgment, in Lebanon and in other parts of the Middle East. But great, thank you very much for the question.
Wonderful. Another very interesting question here too. What do you think about the impact of the new money transfer system BRICS countries are planning to use?
That's a great question. And for me, this is part of a broader issue which affects Iran, but not just Iran, which is that there's a recognition by a number of states, illiberal actors, Iran, Russia, even others such as Saudi Arabia, that there's a vulnerability to transactions through the dollar-denominated system, the currency clearing system, SWIFT, of course, but other ways in which being touched by the use of the dollar makes you subject to things like U.S. Treasury OFAC sanctions. And so I think what you saw in the Kazan Russia meeting was an attempt in a number of different ways, first to develop alternatives for financial clearing. So you see a lot of what's been used in the past, a move towards cryptocurrencies. Venezuela certainly has used a lot of cryptocurrencies to escape sanctions for its oil trade. But you're also seeing direct arrangements, for example, between China and Russia to build that out. And so I think what you saw with the BRICS Clear, which again was just more of in the stage of an idea than anything else. But BRICS Clear is, again, it's part of this idea, which I would say a group of illiberal actors who are completely different in their goals. I mean, when you have Iran and Saudi Arabia, strategic arch rivals in basically the same organization, although Saudi Arabia actually just announced that they were not going to participate in BRICS. But when you have, the thing that unifies them is their desire to escape legal and financial vulnerability to the U.S. system. So I would put BRICS Clear as well as the cross-border exchange mechanisms they talked about, and even the grain exchange that Russia is setting up kind of in that category, and other things that were even beyond BRICS, such as the broader use of China's renminbi and renminbi rather than dollar-denominated contracts. Again, it's all part of that work by illiberal actors, including tied to China, but not just tied to China, to escape from that vulnerability. And so I think having worked for Secretary Pompeo in the first Trump administration there in the policy planning staff, what I saw is that we depend and instinctively use an awful lot things like Treasury OFAC sanctions, and so the more we use it, the more our partners try to escape from it. But the degree to which our partners create alternative mechanisms, it does complicate our ability to apply pressure, through the use of those tools. And so I think we should, this isn't something that's BRICS Clear is not going to go into effect tomorrow, but I think it's important to recognize the whole broader range of attempts to escape vulnerability to both dollar-based currency clearing mechanisms and dollar-based trading mechanisms, and with it, U.S. sanction power, generally. But great question, thank you.
Thank you. And we're just about out of time, but the next question, I'll end with the next question. I apologize to those whose questions I didn't get to, but the next question kind of looks forward, so I think it's a good question to end on. So, given the complexities of the crime-terror nexus exemplified by Hezbollah's activities in Latin America, what strategies or approaches do you believe federal agencies could adopt to effectively disrupt Hezbollah's operations in this region, considering the distinct challenges associated with combating both crime and terror? Let me know if you need me to reread.
No, it's a great question. And to be honest, there is a very broad answer, and this is something we could talk about for literally weeks. But in general, I think there's a couple of principles. Number one is my colleague at National Defense University, Selena Rullo, always says, follow the money. So being able to work with financial intelligence units and others to basically follow those money flows, whether it's Hezbollah or other illicit networks, because oftentimes they interlock within the different kind of criminal financial networks in the region, but understanding where those money flows go, and again that implies healthy FIUs, that implies healthy levels of financial and other cooperations. It implies a good legal frameworks between the U.S. and our partners in the region. Again, kind of understand how those money flows are working. But in addition, again, it also another important piece is relatively confident exchanges of intelligence information and other information. A number of the cases that we mentioned before in the slides, not only U.S. collaboration with our counterparts in the region, but other actors who have a lot of skin in the game, such as Mossad. So again, although the Brazilians denied and it's disputed how much the Mossad actually helped with Operation Trapiche recently, but again, that level of collaboration and data sharing and information sharing, I think, is absolutely vital to understanding these networks. And I think it also conceptually, it's just important to understand the differences. In other words, not treat Hezbollah in the Americas the same as Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, but also recognizing the fungibility of these things, the capacity of Hezbollah as a largely laundering, money generating organization in Latin America to morph into physical terrorism under certain conditions, depending on what happens in the Middle East and vice versa. So always being attentive to the capacity of the organization to change, the fungibility of networks, the interfaces between, again, Hezbollah, terrorist or money networks, and other criminal networks in the region, whether it's the Colombians or the PCC that we mentioned before or others, but just kind of understanding the flows of criminal and terrorist activity and the importance of us working together without, stovepipes across organizations or across frontiers and going after them, whether it's going after their capability to act or going after the money or going after other things. And so great question to end on. And the other thing, again, I wanted to thoroughly thank the group for their time, thank HDAC, and thank you for this time and in permitting me to share my thoughts and work today.
Dr. Ellis, thank you very much. And there was somebody who actually posted in the chat that they would love to have a presentation from you done about the implications of the People's Republic of China in the same area, which is what you presented on with HDIAC in January of this year. So I put the link to Dr. Ellis's previous webinar with us in the chat, but certainly I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. Please, you can reach out to HDIAC if you have questions for Dr. Ellis or just about this topic in general. We can, assign somebody who can actually reach out to Dr. Ellis and any of his other colleagues that may be working in this space and get you some answers on that. If you're working on a government-funded project, that is a free service to everyone. So please reach out to us, and we'd love to help you. But Dr. Ellis, once again, thank you for an amazing presentation. I hope you will come back to us at some point.
Thank you. And for anyone who wants it, I just put my U.S. government Army address up there, robert.e.ellis78.civ@army.mil. So please feel free to reach out. The person who wanted to follow up regarding my work on China or anything else. Again, I'm U.S. Army civilian. I and our team at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute happy to support the work of our government team any way we can. So thanks all for this time. Anyone who wants to reach out, please feel free to use that my official email to reach out to me. And I wish you all much success in all you're doing. And for those for whom it's appropriate, wish you all a very happy and wonderful holiday season with your families.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.